بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله فإن خير الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. أما بعد. Shall continuing in our lessons in Kitab At-Tawheed of Shaykh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhaab rahimahullah, along with the commentary of Shaykh al-Uthaymeen rahimahullah, Al-Qawl Al-Mufeed ala Kitab At-Tawheed. We'll do a review from last lesson so that we can have some revision of what we covered before we begin today's session. So let's begin. What is the definition of Tawheed? To single out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His ibadah. But we mentioned definition last week, more comprehensive, that we can use. Now, to single out Allah and everything that is specific to Him. And remember the Arabic? Is it close? إفراد الله تعالى بما يختص به. بما يختص به. So we mentioned this is the most comprehensive definition of Tawheed that Shaykh Muhammad himself defines in this book and also in one of his fatwa. وإفراد الله سبحانه وتعالى بما يختص به. That includes rububiyyah, uluhiyyah, asma wa sifat, rulership, whatever it may be. Another benefit we want to cover is what is the definition of Tawheed al-Rububiyyah? Last week we spoke about Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. No. Good. Shaykh Muhammad rahimahullah mentions at-Tawheed al-Rububiyyah includes that we single out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fil khalq, in creation, wal mulk, dominion, and tadbir, administration or organization of the universe and the affairs. And we also mentioned something else from Shaykh Salih al-Shaykh. So an easy way to grasp all that Shaykh Atim was mentioning. طيب, whose actions? Allah's. Tawheedullah, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah is Tawheedullah bi-af'alihi. Right? So Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bi-af'alihi, in His actions. Which means that everything that Allah does subhanahu wa ta'ala is only specific to Him and His actions, we have to single Him out. That includes creation, life and death, protection. So we mentioned last week, it's not limited to what Shaykh Muhammad mentioned of the three, but we add more. As Shaykh Salih al-Shaykh mentioned, like life and death, creation, protection, harm, benefit, anything specific to Allah, we must give it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tawheedullahi bi-af'alihi, in His actions. One more thing, let's mention also that the three categories of Tawheed that we all are aware of, where do we derive them from? And how do we know, how can we prove that there are such categories in the first place? Induction, good. The ulama say that these categories of Tawheed are produced through Istiqra'u. Istiqra'u means induction of the Kitab and the Sunnah. So if we study the book and the Sunnah, we will find these three categorizations. Not that necessarily the names will be there, but in Sharia, not everything has to be mentioned by name for it to be there. We can find its proofs that the ulama induce it from it, and then they categorize it. And Istiqra'u is from fiqh, and the ulama have used this in many things. And as we mentioned, we said last week from Imam al-Shinqiti, Bakr Abu Zayd, and many of the ulama. So now we don't have to look for specific proof. We say it from the categorization, there's already proof in general, and the categorization the ulama deduced or induced. And likewise, we mentioned the discussion about different categories. طيب, let's look into today's lesson, inshallah. And today we're going to begin with Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, because we stopped last week in Shaykh Ibn Abdul's introduction, where he introduced the topic of Tawheed, got into the discussion about the Rububiyyah, how to prove Allah's existence to the aql, and then of course to the text, the categorization of Tawheed. Now we're going to finish his introduction today, where he discusses the last two major categories, Tawheed al-Ibadah or Uluhiyyah, and Tawheed al-Asma'i wa Sifat. And then we'll start with that for today, and then next week go from the beginning of the actual text, meaning when Shaykh al-Islam brings his evidences into the topic. So طيب, we'll begin reading. Alright, so for those who may have the English translation of القول المفيد, القول المفيد, you can read from it. Otherwise, we'll read it and we'll comment on that which we need to benefit from. And again, this is available for those who wish to buy it or to receive a copy. It will become easy for us also in our study if we have a copy. It's much easier to follow along. Alright, so it says here in the translation, the second form, second category, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. It is also called Tawheed al-Ibadah, singling out Allah with worship. When it is mentioned in connection with Allah, it is called Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. But if it is mentioned in connection with the creatures or the creation, it is called Tawheed al-Ibadah. So the first benefit we take from that, if we're talking about Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah in relation to Allah, that's what we call it. But if we say Tawheed in relation to the creation, we call Tawheed al-Ibadah. So now we see Tawheed al-Ibadah and Uluhiyyah the same thing, but in two different considerations. It's important. So now, because Ibadah has to come from the servant, so usually we have to single out Allah in the Ibadah, so we refer to that category, that type of Tawheed as Ibadah. But as for Allah, when we're considering the Tawheed of Uluhiyyah regarding Allah, we call Uluhiyyah. We call Uluhiyyah. So that's now a benefit, makes us understand that the terms are referring to the same thing, but from two different considerations. Now he says, Rahimahullah, it is to single out Allah the Mighty and Sublime with worship. So that's the definition of Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. هو الإفراد الله عز وجل بالعبادة. This is often when you find a discussion about Tawheed, often you find this definition used. This is important. Like if you read Salat al-Usul or Kitab At-Tawheed or any work of Tawheed, usually you hear or read the Tawheed هو الإفراد الله عز وجل بالعبادة. But now we can say that's one type of Tawheed, right? This definition is referring to which one? Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. Because we know there's Tawheed al-Rububiyyah and Asma' al-Sifat which will come. So this is important. That's one definition. We're going to mention other definitions as well. So Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah هو الإفراد الله عز وجل بالعبادة, in worship. And then he says, therefore the one deserving of worship is Allah the Exalted. He says, ذلك بأن الله هو الحق وأن ما يدعون من دونه الباطل وأن الله هو العلي الكبير. Allah says that is because it is Allah alone who is the true God, and whatever they call upon besides Him is false, and because it is Allah alone who is the Most High, the incomparably great. Surah Luqman, ayah 30. I don't think it's Surah Luqman, ayah 30. Surah Luqman, ayah 30. So here, Shaykh continues, now the term Ibadah is widely used for two things. So now he's going to discuss Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah by first going into the term al-Ibadah. What does the word worship intend and mean? Before we get there, we see here that the argument is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, since He is the only creator, sustainer, provider, which we affirm, and most of the creations, all of them affirm too, the Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, therefore Allah deserves the worship. فَمُسْتَحِقٌ لِعِبَادٍ. And this is something which we can use as a discussion. When we affirm Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, by necessity you must affirm Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. So they go hand in hand. Once someone affirms Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, by necessity they must affirm Tawheed al-Ibad or Ubudiyyah, Uluhiyyah. Because if you agree that Allah is the only creator, the only sustainer, the only provider, then therefore you must only single Him out in worship. Very important. So this is important. That's because Allah says that all the other deities which somebody worships were batil. They are falsehood. So all false deities, and Allah is the only true creator and only true God. So the term al-Ibadah is widely used for two things. Number one, first, worship. That is, submitting to Allah the Mighty and Sublime by acting upon His orders and abstaining from His prohibitions out of love and reverence for Him. So the first intent of al-Ibadah is a ta'abbud, the actual worship. And he says here بمعنى التذلل, along with the meaning of humiliation or submission or subservience. So the first definition of ibadah intending is the actual ta'abbud, the actual act of worship to Allah. It means actually worshipping Him by having tadallul, humiliation or subservience to Allah, by fulfilling the commands and staying away from the prohibitions. And most of the time when we talk about al-ibadah, we actually are referring many of us to the second category. The first one we have to understand that part of the essence of ibadah is tadallul. It's not the only part, but the essence of it, which is humiliation and subservience. So when we talk about worship, we don't just say something is worship unless it has those qualities which are necessary in worship. The Shaykh is going to get there. So one of them is tadallul. And the next one he's going to add here, which is al-mahabba wa ta'zeem. Mahabba wa ta'zeem. Very important. Mahabbatan wa ta'zeema, he says. We must have love along with it and veneration. So therefore, when you talk about al-ibadah, you don't just mean worship. You mean worship. What is worship? Right? Somebody say, what is that? What do you mean when you say worship? You say, to worship means you have tadallul, the utmost humiliation and subservience, along with mahabba wa ta'zeem for that which is being worshipped. So when worshipping Allah, we have these elements. And how do we do it? فِعْلِ الْأَوَامِرِ وَتَرْكِ النَّوَاهِي. Very important, right? So now when you understand this, it doesn't confuse us when somebody may say that somebody's worshipping something. We'll give you an example. Sometimes someone may see, or something may be claiming, that Muslims may worship other than Allah. When they see us making sujood near the Kaaba when we go to Haram Mecca. Right? You see Muslims are making tawaf or making sujood or salah. We're facing the Kaaba and we're praying. Somebody may say that you're worshipping it. How do we respond to that? It's very important. This is some of the things that some people may ask. Why are you doing this? We say the Kaaba is the Qibla. Allah made for us. But what's the next point? What does worship mean? You have to have tadallul, or mahabba, or ta'zeem. Do we have that for the Kaaba when we're praying? No. We're doing it for Allah.
What about
right?
the laws that's not Allah's laws? Is it for the same?
What is it?
What about the laws that's not Allah's laws?
Well, this is part of the Tawheed here. We're going to get there. Right now we're talking about the ta'abbud. So when you get to that, then you get to the next part, which is the next definition, which is al-muta'abbad bihi. First is the definition of ibadah is ta'abbud. Ta'abbud means to worship. And it has to have these elements. Tadallul, humiliation, subservience. Next, mahabba, love. And the last one, ta'zeem, veneration. And the next one, al-thani, second definition, which most of us are familiar with, al-muta'abbad bihi. The second is that ibadah may refer to that which is done as an act of worship. So, what by which worship is done? An act by which you worship Allah. So the first definition is of worship. The second, what is the act you do as a type of worship? Right? The act that you do, which is considered worship. He says there, فَمَعْنَاهَا كَمَا قَالَ شَيْخُ الْإِسْلَامِ ابْنِ تَيْمِيَّةَ. Therefore, the meaning of this is that Shaykh Islam Taymiyyah mentions about ibadah, and most of us are familiar with this definition. اسم الجامع لكل ما يحبه الله ويرضاه من الأقوال والأعمال ظاهرة وباطنة. Most of us know the most comprehensive definition of al-ibadah is what Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah mentions, which is that it's a comprehensive term for everything Allah loves and is pleased with, from actions and statements, apparent and hidden. This definition, most of us are familiar with when we talk about ibadah, but it's one of the two definitions. That's for the muta'abbad bihi. That's for the way you worship Allah. To what Allah is pleased with, to what Allah loves, statements, actions. But if someone says, what is worship? We say worship is to worship something, means you have to have tadallul, mahabba, ta'zeem, utmost, all of it in the utmost form for Allah. So now does that make sense then? When we say al-ibadah, we have two angles, two parts. One is ta'abbud, worship itself, which includes those two elements. And the second one is what you worship Allah through. And now Shaykh al-Uthaymeen clarifies it to an example. For example, to make things clear. He says, مثال ذلك. Give you an example. For that, as-salah. Salah is an example. فعلها عبادة. Doing salah is worship. When you pray salah, you're worshipping Allah. وهو تعبد. Right? So you're worshipping Allah when you do salah because you have humiliation there, you have love for Allah in there, you have veneration of Allah in there. At the same time, the act of salah is muta'abbad bihi. It's an act by which you worship Allah. That makes sense? So salah is an example. Salah itself is ibadah because there's humiliation, there's all that things we mentioned. And in and of itself, it's an act by which you worship Allah. Because you have to worship with salah. Ma shara Allah, when Allah legislated. So salah is an example from two angles. Is it clear? Right, so salah is ibadah. Because you have the elements of worship in it. At the same time, you worship Allah through it because it's an act of worship. And not just any act, as we know, one of the best of acts that we can do. The second pillar of Islam. So I hope that becomes clear to us. When we say al-ibadah, what we mean by that. And to make clear also, the definition of al-ibadah, Imam Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah, he mentioned in his Nunniyah, some of us might have read this or heard this before, Ibadatul Rahmani ghayatu hubbihi. Imam Ibn Qayyim says rahimahullah, worshipping Allah, Ar-Rahman, is of the utmost, includes the utmost of love for him. Ma'adhul li'abidihi huma qutbani. So he mentions in his Nunniyah, Imam Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah, Ibadatul Rahman. The worship of Ar-Rahman is what? The utmost love for him. So one of the things we just mentioned you have to have is love. There's one. Ma'adhul, along with humiliation, subservience of who? Abidihi, the one who's worshiping Allah. Huma qutbani. The two pillars, two poles you must have. So in this line of poetry, remember Ibn Qayyim Nunniyah mentions the two things you must have in worship. At the very least, tadallul, which is the essence. And Shaykh Muhammad mentioned that the essence of worship is humiliation, subservience. Because we have to submit ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then along with that, utmost love for him, and the same that's the last one, and also veneration. So this becomes clear then? So we can see that then there are three elements there you have to have in worship. What are they? Love, utmost love, tadallud, utmost humiliation and subservience, and submission, and ta'zeem, veneration. You have these three, then you have included that, that's ibadah. Then the second definition is muta'abbad bihi, what you're worshiping Allah through, which is that which Allah legislated. It's very important. Because we cannot worship Allah through innovation or any way we want. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides what we have to worship Allah through. Is it clear so far? طيب. I want to go backwards a bit and talk about Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah as a way to help us understand, like we did before. We can get a definition that's easier to comprehend, or a definition that's easier for us to work with. First, the word uluhiyyah is taken from the word alaha ya'lahu, which means when you are worshipping something, you have this word alaha ya'lahu. And in there is where the word uluhiyyah is derived from, as a benefit. Sometimes, right, you may even hear or you see it's only Tawheed al-Ilahiyyah even, in the sense that it's part of the uluhiyyah is that you have to accept the divinity of Allah. As we already mentioned, uluhiyyah as before. But now, what is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah? Shaykh Salih al-Shaykh, he mentions, وَتَوْحِيدُ اللَّهِ. He says, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. هُوَ تَوْحِيدُ اللَّهِ. It is to single out, or the Tawheed of Allah. بأفعال العبد المتنوعة. توحيد الألوهية, he says, هو توحيد الله. It's the Tawheed of Allah. بأفعال العبد. Through the actions of the different actions of the servants. Through the different actions of the servants. بأفعال العبد المتنوعة. And he mentions this in his book, it-Tawheed, Sharh Kitab At-Tawheed, page 7. it-Tawheed, Sharh Kitab At-Tawheed. Why is definition important or helpful? What's Tawheed al-Rububiyyah mean again? Let's compare it to Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. What is it again? Good. Tawheed Allahi bi-af'alihi. Whose actions? Allah's actions. Okay, now what is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah? Who remembers now? We say good. If Tawheed al-Rububiyyah is Tawheed of Allah, singling out Allah in His actions, then Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah is singling out Allah through the actions of the servants. Different actions. So Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah or Tawheed al-Ibadah, it comes from who? The servants giving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala His right. Makes sense? So if you compare the two definitions, like in a chart or something like this, if you say what is the difference between Rububiyyah and Uluhiyyah, one is to single out Allah in His actions, that's Rububiyyah. And then the next one, we give Allah, single out Allah's right to the actions of the servants for Allah. So that definition of Shaykh is helpful because now we can see in relation to actions. Like one singling out Allah in His action, next is single out Allah in His right of worship to the servants' actions. At the end of this, we see that the Tawheed part, it has these different categories. If we understand the definitions, easier to explain, easier to understand. And from that angle, we also see then, if it's to single out Allah in His actions, then we understand as well that it's Allah's right upon the servants. We mentioned last week that one of the names of this book is Kitab At-Tawheed alladhi huwa haqqullahi al-'abid. That's one of the titles you may find at times. Kitab At-Tawheed, which is the right of Allah upon the servants. And we said it's based on the hadith of Mu'adh bin Jabal radiyallahu ta'ala anhu in the Sahihain. Alright, so far we have this. So someone can mention to us the definition Tawheed, At-Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. What is the definition again? Good. At-Tawheed Allah, the Tawheed of Allah bi-af'al abd, through the action of the servant. There are different types. Or as Shaykh Muhammad mentioned, another way to look at it is what ifradullahi subhanahu wa ta'ala bil-ibadah. Now we'll continue reading from Al-Qawl Al-Mufeed. So it said, for example, we mentioned the Salah. Its observance is worship. So praying Salah is worship. The same Salah is worship because it's something which you worship Allah with. So when we say al-ibadah, there's ta'abbud and muta'abbid bihi. It includes both angles. Worshipping Allah and also an act by which you worship Allah through. To single out Allah with this form of Tawheed is to be subservient to Allah alone, submitting to Him alone out of love and reverence for Him, and worshipping Him with what He has approved. So Shaykh Muhammad then he concludes discussion of ibadah, the definition, by saying that Tawheed, therefore, in this angle, أن تكون عبدا لله وحده, that you be servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, by worshipping Him alone through humiliation, or subservience or submission, mahabba, love, ta'zeem, وتعبده بما شرع, and worshipping Him by that which He has legislated. Because we know we're not allowed to worship Allah through innovation to that which we make up. Allah tells us in the Quran, لَهُمْ شُرَكَاءَ, perhaps they may have other deities, شَرَعُوا لَهُمْ مِنَ الدِّينِ مَا لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهِ. Perhaps they may have other deities that legislate for Him that which Allah didn't legislate. And we know the hadith Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha, where the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, مَنْ أَحْدَثَ فِي أَمْرِنَا هَذَا مَا لَيْسَ مِنْهُ فَهُوَ رَدٌّ. Whoever does an act that or innovates an act into, or innovates something to the affair of ours which is not from it, it's rejected. Alright. Then Shaykh Muhammad says, Allah the Exalted says, لا تجعل مع الله إلها آخر فتقعد مذموما مخذولا. So set up not another God with lest Allah sits you down condemned and forsaken. Do not set up another God with Allah lest Allah sits you down condemned and forsaken. Surah Isra ayah 22. And He the Most High also says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds. Surah Fatiha. And He says, by describing Himself as the Lord of the worlds, it is like stating the reason for His deserving of worship, of being worshipped. He is the only one worthy only worthy deity, since He is the Lord of the worlds. Allah the Exalted says, Ya ayyuhan nasu u'budu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum walladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. O you mankind, worship your Lord who created you and those before you, so that you may attain righteousness. Surah Baqarah, Ayah 21. The one who is set apart, i.e. whoever has made a partner with Allah in the creation, does not deserve of being worshipped. So this is connected to what we said earlier, that rububiyyah goes along with al-uluhiyyah. So if someone were to say, I affirm Allah is the only creator, I affirm Allah's lordship, by necessity they must also affirm His worship. As Allah says in this verse, O you mankind, worship your Lord who created you and those who were before you, so they may gain taqwa. So Allah combined between here that Allah is who created you, so rububiyyah. So what is the necessitate? U'budu rabbakum. So worship your Lord. So whoever affirms rububiyyah by necessity must affirm al-uluhiyyah. And we know the mushrikeen, others who didn't accept it. This is why the Shaykh writes this book, to clarify how Tawheed, all of its categories are connected. And you must affirm all of them for someone to be considered a person of Tawheed the way that he should be. Then he continues, the Shaykh saying, it is from sheer foolishness to make a creature or creation which is only brought into existence and will perish, to make him a deity who is worshipped, when in reality it cannot benefit you. It can neither bring you to life nor sustain you nor extend your lifespan. As such, it is also from stupidity or foolishness that you go to the grave of someone who is already rotten in the grave to supplicate to him and worship him. He is rather in need of your supplications, while you are not in any need of supplicating to him. He cannot bring benefit or harm to himself. How could he then have such an ability regarding others? This is something which we covered in the lesson we did earlier from Imam San'ani's book, it-Tawheed. We mentioned the foolishness and the ignorance of worshipping graves. Because we know from the Sunnah, when you go to the graveyard, what are we supposed to say if it's a Muslim graveyard? Anyone knows what are we supposed to say when we go there? MashaAllah. So dua, alright, established. So we asking Allah, we're sending salam to those who passed in the graves, ceased, and then we're asking Allah, for them and for us, afiyah, and like this. We're making dua for them. We're not going there asking them anything. So here we see that what we mentioned from San'ani, again coming and getting that benefit, that we're not supposed to call upon the graves. We're supposed to make dua for them. Let them know the opposite. And that's another affirmation, right? That Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Wahhaab and Shaykh Imam San'ani, that what they call to is the same. You see the connection? We mentioned in the beginning, the San'ani being contemporary of Shaykh al-Islam, the da'wah is the same. And what they call to was also affirmed. And this is not the book where he confirms everything that he says. We said that's another book, Kashf Shubahat, but still in here we find this. And so we see the benefit, right, of these different books and reading them to see that the subject of Tawheed interlap, the ulama are calling towards the same benefits. So then he says this category of Tawheed is disbelieved and rejected by the majority of the creation. Owing to this fact, Allah sent the messengers, may peace be upon them, and sent books down to them. Allah the Exalted said, مثلهم كمثل الذي استوقد نارا فلما أضاءت ما حوله ذهب الله بنورهم وتركهم في ظلمات. Allah says that we did not send. I think they have the ayah here, different than here. This is the correct ayah. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِكَ مِنْ رَسُولٍ إِلَّا نُوحِي إِلَيْهِ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنَا فَاعْبُدُونَ. Allah says, and we did not send before you, or we did not send before you a messenger, except we inspired him, saying that there is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah, so worship me. There's a mistake in this. So I think the ayah should be this one, since it says there, Surah Anbiya, ayah 25. And the ayah they have here is Surah Baqarah. The ayah they have here is Surah Baqarah. It's not the same ayah. So now he says that's the benefit, that's the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the messengers, is in order to guide the people to, and sent the books as well, to guide the people to Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, due to them not following it. And then he says, along with that, you see that the messengers, the followers of the messengers were very few. So despite Allah sending the books and sending the messengers, those who followed the messengers are very few. Those who followed them are very few. What's the proof? The Shaykh says the proof is the statement of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he says, "And I saw a prophet with a group of people, and a prophet with one or two persons, and a prophet with whom there was nobody." Hadith of Ibn Abbas and Bukhari and Muslim. فَرَأَيْتُ النَّبِيُّ مَعَهُ رَهْطٌ. I saw a prophet, he said, and with him was a group. وَنَبِيٌّ, and a prophet, وَمَعَهُ رَجُلٌ. Along with him was one man, or رَجُلان, or two. وَنَبِيٌّ وَلَيْسَ مَعَهُ أَحَدٌ. And I saw a prophet, there is no one with him. And commenting on this, right, Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen, in another place, another works, he commented on this hadith, and he mentioned that the word rahat means at-taqleel. It means something small in number. الذي ما بين الثلاثة إلى عشرة. So rahat is a group between the numbers of 3 to 10. That's what rahat means. So if you look at the hadith, then we see a prophet who came with 3 to 10 people, another one who had 1 or 2 followers, and one who had no followers. And despite that, right, Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen mentions that despite the fact that some prophets didn't have many followers, it doesn't mean they're not successful. It's very important. Some may say, subhanAllah, no followers. The prophets were still successful because the wisdom of them being sent was to be a proof against mankind in establishing the Tawheed, and so no one can have an argument that didn't receive a messenger and the message. So very important, we don't look at that hadith and say, oh, no followers, they were not successful. No, all of them were successful. And he mentions this benefit in Sharh al-Salihin, page 548, volume 1. And then he mentions the benefit here, the Shaykh, and also added to this, we want to mention that another example is of Nuh alayhi salam. And we know Nuh, how long he was giving da'wah, and how many people followed him. وَمَا آمَنَ مَعَهُ إِلَّا قَلِيلٌ. And not many, and those who believed in him, were only a few. Only a few. And he was doing da'wah for how many years? 950 years. Allah mentioned in the Quran. Right, so this is important. This shows again, most people, the proof Sheikh's mentioning here, most people didn't follow the messengers in this angle. But it doesn't mean, right, that they were not they were successful. But the point is that shows the importance of Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. For most of mankind, they're in need of da'wah towards it. Then he says, Tanbih, and point of note, he says, that it's amazing that most of the latter authors on the subject of Tawheed emphasize Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, as if they are addressing the people who reject the existence of their Lord. Although those who reject the Lord may be found, quite a large number of even Muslims fall into associate parties with Allah in worship. So a point of reference, many of the authors, contemporary and latter scholars, especially those of the latter scholars, or even some of them before, many of them before, when they talk about Tawheed, they usually limit it to Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, instead of focusing on Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. The Shaykh says this is a mistake. Why? Because majority of people, they affirm Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. We said last week, even Fir'aun, right, despite his apparent arrogance, deep down he believed and he affirmed. So therefore, most people are near Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, not Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. But when you look at certain books, you see them, they talk about Tawheed and limited to Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, not talking about Uluhiyyah. And that Shaykh says is some of the ajab, the amazing affairs, very wondersome. Why are people doing that? Why are they even doing this? He says, therefore, it is essential to pay attention to this aspect of Tawheed so that we make it known to those Muslims who say they are Muslim but are actually polytheists while they know not. It means, unfortunately, many Muslims, they are falling into polytheism, shirk, and they're not aware of it because of their lack of understanding or ignorance regarding the issue of Tawheed of Uluhiyyah. Now the Shaykh moves on to the Qism al-Thalith, the third category, Tawheed al-Asma' wa Sifat. Before we get there, we want to review a bit of what we mentioned. Right? So what is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah? What is a Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah? Good, that's the Tawheed of Allah through the action of the servant, which are different types. What's another way of mentioning that? Some may say, okay, maybe they don't remember that definition. So, Ifradullah subhanahu wa ta'ala bil-ibad, to single out Allah in His worship. That's one we mentioned. Also, what is the essence of worship? What do you need to have in worship for it to be considered worship? Humiliation, good. Tadallul, next. Love, and last, ta'zeem, veneration, good. And then we mentioned the example of the salah. And then he also mentioned Shaykh Rahimahullah, Shaykh Islam's definition. And this is the most common and comprehensive definition. What is that definition? Who knows it? If someone says, give me a comprehensive definition of at-Tawheed, and you want to mention to them what's the best one, that was Shaykh al-Islam said, rahimahullah. What is it? English or Arabic, whoever remembers. A comprehensive term for everything Allah loves. From what? Statements and actions, apparent and hidden. So that's the most comprehensive one. And it's coupled with what we just mentioned earlier. Together they form the word ibadah. Right? So this is hopefully clear. Inshallah, if it's not, we can clarify more. Before we move to the next category, which is Tawheed of Allah's names and attributes, which is the last one, which we want to cover today, in the introduction of Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen. This is the introduction of Ibn Uthaymeen before he opens into the subject of Shaykh al-Islam's Kitab At-Tawheed. So we have some background. Now I mentioned the third category, which is Tawheed of Allah's names and attributes. So the definition, he says, وَالْإِفْرَادُ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلْ بِمَا لَهُ مِنَ الْأَسْمَاءِ وَصِفَاتِ. Tawheed of Asma' wa Sifat is to single out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes that belong to Him. وَالْإِفْرَادُ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلْ بِمَا لَهُ مِنَ الْأَسْمَاءِ وَصِفَاتِ. That which belongs to Him, singling out Allah with that which belongs to Him of His names and attributes. So that's a basic definition. And what this shows us is the essence is that Allah has names and attributes. So in order to have Tawheed of Allah's names and attributes, you have to believe Allah has names and attributes. وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. Allah says in the Quran, for to Allah belong the most beautiful names, so call upon Him, call Allah upon them, or using them. So he says, وَهَذَا يَتَضَمَّنُ شَيْئَيْنِ. So it includes two things. You need to have two things in order to have Tawheed of Allah's names and attributes. So Tawheed of Allah's names and attributes, وَالْإِفْرَادُ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلْ بِمَا لَهُ مِنَ الْأَسْمَاءِ وَصِفَاتِ. To single out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that which He has of names and attributes. And it includes two parts. Two things you must have. Number one, affirmation. Al-Ithbat. And what is the affirmation of? We should affirm for Allah the Mighty and Sublime all His names and attributes which He affirmed for Himself in His book or in the Sunnah of His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So number one, affirmation, al-Ithbat. All the names and attributes Allah has affirmed for Himself in His book, and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam has affirmed for Him in His Sunnah. That's number one. Number two, rejection of like. Nafi al-Mumathara. You have to deny al-Mumathara, any comparison or any like for Allah's names. So you must reject any like, any comparative or comparable to Allah's names and attributes. Which the Shaykh says it means, we should not associate any partner with Allah in His names and attributes. As Allah, He the Exalted says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There's nothing like Him, there's nothing comparable unto Him, and He is all hearing, all seeing. Surah Shura, Ayah 11. So those are two you need to have. So Tawheed al-Asma' wa Sifat, two things are involved in it or included. Number one, al-Ithbat, affirming all of Allah's names and attributes, which is He has affirmed for Himself or His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Sunnah. Number two, Nafi al-Mumathara, denying any type of comparison or like or comparable to Allah, not associating any partners with Allah. Now I want to mention also that we can say in general, right, this applies to both the names and attributes. And it's specific to the attributes, right? Some of the authors, they mention there are three things you need. So regarding Allah's names and attributes, we mentioned both of them, you need to have these two. But regards specifically to His names, some of the people of knowledge, they mention a third one. Right? So you have the affirmation, you also have denial of anything besides Allah, and you have also in there al-Imrar. Al-Imrar, they say, means passing it on. Al-Imrar means passing on the names, the attributes specifically, as they came to us. Mirruha kama ja'at. Some of the Salaf will say, pass it on as they have come to us. So some ulama mention when it comes to Allah's attributes specifically, there's three things. One of them is, like we mentioned earlier, al-Ithbat. Another one included there is denying that which is worship, that associating partners. Another one is this specifically al-imrar, passing them as they came. Right? So as we narrate to us, without asking about the how, and we're going to get to that, without denying them, what are all these things that we shouldn't be doing? And some of them also mention, similar to the ithbat, al-iqrar, which is similar in meaning, which is also means affirmation. So for asma and sifat, they mention al-imrar, very important. We pass them all as they came to us. And the salaf, they passed it to us as they heard from the Sahaba, who heard from the Messenger ﷺ, as reported in the Quran, like this. But when it comes to both of them, names and attributes, these two we need to have. And this is important because we see here that both are involved, affirmation and denial. Just like when it comes to the Shahada, the two pillars which they revolve around, which the Shahada revolves around is al-nafi wal-ithbat, affirmation and denial. Then the Shaykh says here, this verse proves that all his attributes, no one is like him among the creatures or the creation. Even if they share in the basic meaning of the word, they actually differ in the essence. Therefore, whoever does not affirm what Allah has affirmed for himself is a mu'attil, a denier, and this rejection of his is like that of Fir'aun. The first thing now the Shaykh benefits us is that from the ayah, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, what we learned is there's nothing comparable to Allah. So even if a creation have the same name as Allah, or a similar attribute, that doesn't necessitate to have similarity in essence. Very important. Sharing a name does not mean there's a sharing in the essence. And this is one thing that people who fall to this issue of ta'til, of denial, or emptying Allah's names of His names and attributes of their meanings. This is one thing they're not understanding. That they say, well, Allah is all hearing, as-sami', so no one can have this quality at all, even using the word. And by even doing this, right, we're falling into any type of resemblance. So we need to establish that the names, similarity names are not meaning similarity in essence, because we say, يَلِيقُ بِجَلَالِهِ, befitting, in accordance, Allah's names and attributes befitting His majesty. I will give an example. Allah is as-sami' al-basir. A mankind has hearing and seeing. We're not all hearing. We're not all seeing. Allah described in us in Surah Al-Insan as how? Innahu. Anyone knows the ayah in Surah Al-Insan how Allah describes mankind? فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. Allah made mankind how? Hearing and seeing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as-sami' al-basir. Allah called the creation hearing and seeing. Obviously our hearing and seeing is deficient, not complete. But does that mean we can't use that name? Allah called us this. But does that mean that just because the names have similarities, that there's a similarity in essence? Of course not. Because لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ وَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالَ. All these evidences are proving that. But Shaykh's mentioning here that just because the name may be shared at times, we should never associate, think that they are shared in essence. As Shaykh Salih had a Shaykh, he also mentions likewise. And he gives some examples, some names where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed the creation to have, but not similar in essence. But then he mentioned the point, whoever denies that which Allah has affirmed for himself is a mu'attil, which means one who's in denial, or one who's a denier. And this is the way of who? Fir'aun. So we get a benefit here. Where does ta'til come from? Or who are those people who are followers of ta'til? Fir'aun. In fact, if I remember correctly, in Masail al-Jahiliyyah, the Shaykh Islam adds that that's the way of Jahiliyyah, ta'til. And he mentioned Fir'aun's ta'til, his way of denial. Denying of Allah's names and attributes, denial of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that which He affirms from. So if you see the Fir'aun of this purpose denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He's above, or in question about Allah's essence, this is not the way of the Muslim. Because Allah knows Himself best. Very important. If Allah affirms, you must affirm it. Because Allah knows Himself best. But He says, but whoever affirms them, the opposite, but makes tashbih, gives resemblance, right, giving Allah human attributes, or human attributes to Allah, is like the idlers, or polytheists, who join partners with Allah in worship. So if you affirm them, but you make tashbih, or tamthil, then you are actually like the polytheists, mushrikeen, who worship idols. For these people, they take the creation as a deity. So one of them, whoever makes ta'til, is following the ways of Fir'aun. And the other one who affirms them, makes tashbih or tamthil, he's following the way of the polytheists. But he says, whoever affirms the names and attributes without joining partners with Allah, that's the muwahhid. So very important then. Right? That's the muwahhid. Right? The one who affirms Allah's names and attributes, while at the same time not associating partners with Allah. That's the muwahhid. Right? So you see how Ahl Sunnah always were moderate. Right? We're not into extremes and we're not into ignorance. We're always in moderation. He says in regards to this category that some among the Muslims went astray. Very important now. This is all introduction. We have to have some background. Many Muslims have been led astray in this chapter. So he says many have went astray and got split into different sects. Some of them follow the path of ta'til, emptying and rejecting Allah's names and attributes. They rejected the attributes, claiming to uphold Allah's greatness thereby. So where does this idea of ta'til, emptying Allah's names or rejecting them, come from? Out of a feeling of trying to transcend Allah. So out of efforts to transcend Allah and His Majesty, they denied Allah's names and attributes, which is wrong, clearly, because Allah affirmed them. Allah also affirms from Himself in the Quran His transcendence. So it doesn't make any sense that you can transcend Allah and wait until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us the opposite of. So that's a mistake. And He says that they rejected this and they went astray. This is owing to the fact that he whose greatness has been actually defended is he regarding whom defective attributes of blemish are rejected. So Shaykh says now the true tanzih, the true way to transcend Allah is by actually freeing Allah from any naqas wal aib, by freeing Allah from any deficiency and blemish. And Allah does that in the Quran. So anyone who tries to use ta'til to do this, we say this is a mistake, for Allah knows Himself best, and Allah has affirmed His names and attributes, and He's already transcended Himself. So this is a true mistake. But as for, he said, what they do, emptying Allah of His names and attributes, is in fact actually the opposite effect occurs. He says, so if one says Allah does not have hearing, sight, knowledge, ability, right? By way of ta'til, you just deny all of these, what happens? You have not actually upheld Allah's perfection, but rather He has attributed the worst deficiency to Allah. Because what is it that's worse if you say Allah doesn't hear, doesn't see, doesn't know, doesn't have ability? How is that transcendence? Right? That's actually the opposite, that's deficiency. So Shaykh says, see how the shaitan fooled them, how Allah misled them. Shaitan misled them to this by falling into these doubts. If we go back to the origin, is that you affirm what Allah affirms from Himself. You affirm what the Messenger affirmed from Himself. If you do this, you're always in the correct way. Then he says but rather He has attributed the worst deficiencies to Him and described confusion and misguidance to His words. Because Allah repeatedly mentions in the Quran, Sami'un Basir, Azizun Hakim, Ghafur Rahim. Allah says in many places in the Quran, Allah is all hearing, the all seeing, the noble, the wise, the oft forgiving, the merciful. So if Allah said this often in the Quran, but He didn't really intend it, means if He affirms this Allah Himself in His speech, but He doesn't really possess these qualities, then this is the worst of confusion and misguidance and a great defect in the speech of Allah the Almighty. So another outcome, ill effect, if Allah didn't really intend that He's all hearing, but He still used it, then He's confusing the people. And we cannot say Allah is the author, Allah is one who's called to confusion and misguidance. How can it be? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's book is free of any contradiction, distortion. La ya'tihi al-batil. Allah says no false will come to it. So you see now how dangerous the issue of ta'til is and how actually degrading it is. For it actually, the opposite effect occurs. We're actually lowering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not giving His transcendency and His due right. As Allah says in the Qur'an, وَمَا قَدْرُ اللَّهِ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. They didn't give Allah His due right. Then the Shaykh mentioned another way to combat this idea. He says the opposite now, those people who make tamtheel. So those who make ta'til, the summary is that they try to transcend Allah, but in reality what they did was, they not to transcend Allah's perfection, they actually lowered Allah by attributing Him deficiencies. And so therefore they have fallen short and they actually then they're out of what's haram, which you cannot do. Then there's the other group who falls into the tamtheel, which means to likening Allah's attributes to His creation. So this group, they claim to be affirming Allah's attributes, as He described Himself. So they're taking and they say we're affirming them. But what's wrong? They say they went astray because they have not estimated Allah by His due estimation. مَا قَدْرُ اللَّهِ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. They didn't give Allah His due estimation by ascribing blemish and defect to Him, by considering the one who is perfect in every respect like the one who is defective in every respect. So if you say Allah is like the creation, when you're actually saying the same thing that they fell into, which is Allah is deficient, because mankind is created deficient, hasty, weak, all these things. And then he says if the connecting superiority of the perfect with one who is defective implies that you bring down the perfect By comparing Allah to creation, that's a terrible comparison. Because it doesn't say much about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Shaykh mentioned now some lines of poetry. Says, كَمَا قِيلْ أَلَمْ تَرَى أَنَّ السَّيْفِ يَنْقُصُ الْقَدْرَ. You do not see, says the sword, it loses its status or is underestimated. إِذَا قِيلَ إِنَّ السَّيْفِ أَمْضَى مِنْ عَصَى. If you say that the sword cuts more than a stick, or is sharper than the stick. Like, what benefit is that? He said it, repeat it again. Don't you see that the sword is being underestimated if it is said that the sword cuts more than a stick? It's not saying much, right? And this is important. The same way the ones who come and they say we're making tamtheel of Allah through His creation, what have they really done? They haven't said much because they're saying Allah is like His creation, deficient by nature. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. So now they're caught in a huge issue. So therefore, Ahl Sunnah's way is not these. We do what we mentioned earlier, al-ithbat, affirmation, and the next one which you do is the nafi al-mu'athir, denying any type of comparison comparable to Allah. So he says, how about comparing the perfect with defective? This is one of the most serious crimes against Allah the Almighty, the Sublime. However, the mu'attilun, those who deny Allah's names and attributes, are far more grievous in their rejection, although both parties have not estimated Allah in His right. So if we were to compare who has done a worse crime between the mu'attilun and those who do the opposite, those who do tamtheel, the Shaykh says the worst of them, however, the mu'attilun have more grievous. So those who do ta'til are worse than those who do tamtheel. But both are wrong and both are bad. So this kind of categorization is not also good in terms of they both are bad. But if you were to say which is worse, ta'til is worse than tamtheel. So I hope this is clear for us. Now he tells us what we're supposed to do. Right? It's about almost done, right? This section. He says, al-wajib, what's obligatory for us is that we believe in Allah as Allah has described Himself and His names and attributes as He described Himself in His book and upon the tongue of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without tahrif, without distortion, or ta'til, rejection, or takyif, asking about the howness of Allah's attributes, or tamtheel, likening them. So Ahl Sunnah, our way is to affirm Allah's names and attributes without the following things. Number one, tahrif, distortion. So no tahrif. Number two, ta'til, no denial or rejection or emptying Allah's names and attributes. Next, takyif, asking about or just trying to investigate the howness of Allah's attributes, which He didn't tell us, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And lastly, tamtheel, the likening Allah to His creation. As we mentioned, we cannot do this. He said this was the position of Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah and others from the people of knowledge. Tahrif, distortion, is with regards to texts. Ta'til is concerning the beliefs, and takyif concerning the attributes. Now the Shaykh, he makes some very beneficial kind of categorization. He says tahrif, distortion. Where does this tahrif occur? It usually occurs in the texts, the nusus. So when you hear tahrif, you're talking about tahrif is occurring in the nusus, in the text itself, distorting the text. And ta'til, it said, usually you find it when someone's doing ta'til in the beliefs. And takyif, regarding the attributes. And tamtheel, also in the attributes. So just trying to make it easier for us to see differently where these things may occur. Tahrif may occur, or often will occur in the nusus, was ta'til in the beliefs. A takyif and tamtheel usually occur regarding Allah's attributes. So you ask, how is Allah's attributes? Or you try to compare Allah's attributes. Right? But at the end he says, إِلَّا أَنَّهُ أَخَصْ مِنَ التَّكْيِيفِ. So very important. That tamtheel, he says, is more specific. But then, takyif. Ask me how. So he says here, that takyif, right, tamtheel is with respect to attributes, and takyif, however, it says here, in respect to the attribute too, except that it is more specific than takyif. So tamtheel is more specific than takyif. Now I want to mention an example to make it clear. Some may get confused and say, what is tamtheel and what is takyif? How do we know the difference about giving Allah, likening Allah's attributes, and asking about the howness? So first we have to know that Allah has His attributes, there's a howness, but we don't know it. This is what we have to understand. When we say bila kayf, we're saying that without knowing the how. We don't know the how. We're not denying the how. So some people may come and say, why are you denying the howness of Allah's attributes? So we're not denying them. We don't have knowledge of them. Allah didn't tell us, so therefore we don't have knowledge of it. We're not denying it. That's number one. Number two, Ibn Uthaymeen explains the difference between these two in one of his work, Sharh Lum'at al-I'tiqad. He tells the difference between the two in a nice example. So he says here, difference between tamtheel and takyif. What is the difference? For tamtheel, it means you're telling us, or you mention the specific howness of Allah's attribute by restricting it to a comparison or a comparable. So tamtheel is when you are telling us the how of Allah's attribute. How? You're doing this to specifically restricting it to a comparison. So you're giving a comparable to Allah and saying that's how Allah's attribute is. That's tamtheel. So tamtheel, you have to have a comparable, a comparison going on. Whereas takyif is to mention a specific characteristic without restricting a comparison. So takyif, you're giving a specific characteristic without restricting a comparison or comparable. So I'll give you the example Shaykh Muhammad gives and maybe become clear. So he says, here's an example of tamtheel. Someone, for example, were to say that the hand of Allah is like the hand of a man. That's tamtheel. Why is it? Because you've given a specific example of Allah's hand. And you've given us also a specific characteristic by giving us that example. That's tamtheel. Whereas takyif would be just to imagine in your mind that Allah has a hand in a way that you've imagined it without having any example for it. So that's takyif, he said. So now takyif, you don't have an example that you've seen before, just to imagine something, I say that's how Allah's hand is. That's takyif. Whereas tamtheel would be, you give a specific example. Tahrif is distort. So distorting the text it can occur to the meaning or the wording. So takyif and tamtheel both are wrong. But we see a difference here. One is more, Shaykh says, إِلَّا أَنَّهُ أَخَصْ مِنْ takyif. Tamtheel is more specific than takyif. So therefore tamtheel involves takyif, but takyif is not tamtheel. The second example of takyif would be, so tamtheel is to say Allah's hand is like Allah's hand of creation. Or takyif would be to say Allah's hand is like, or to imagine how Allah's hand is in your mind, just come up with an example of your own, without having a specific example you've seen before. So you just kind of visualize or imagine something, which is haram. Very note, we're not allowed to do that. Right? You cannot envision Allah in your mind or imagine things. So that's takyif. The point is, both of them are wrong. Ahl Sunnah, we don't do any of these. And then the Shaykh will get now to the issue of tahrif, right? And this will be the ending, right? The part of this session. He says that when you hear tahrif, he says here that it's sometimes we mean by the word tahrif, ta'wil, interpretation. And this is by distorting the text regarding the attributes because they call themselves Ahlul Ta'wil. Some people say they were doing ta'wil, we're interpreting Allah's names and attributes. But really what's going on there is they're doing tahrif. And they're distorting the actual text. And it says here, since the heart basically lies in the word and the issue of tahrif. However, this is from the word, right, a way of decoration and allurement. So some people of innovation, they call themselves Ahlul Ta'wil, people of interpretation. And they say we're doing ta'wil of Allah's names and attributes. Or ta'wil, they're not, they're doing tahrif. They're actually changing the whole meaning, even sometimes the wording. And this is again, to be careful if you hear them saying this, because it's not true what they're saying. But he says ta'wil, right, as they claim, but they're not, they're doing tahrif because they're twisting the words from the apparent meaning. And then he says, if this twist was proven by sound evidence, then we don't call it ta'wil in the first place. Right? We call it tafsir. Right? So if somebody's doing interpretation, using evidences, you're doing tafsir. And that's why you remember the lessons that Muawiyah was teaching, he can mention that benefit. Sometimes you may find the word ta'wil used in the books of tafsir, like Imam al-Tabari, to mean tafsir, because he's explaining it to evidences. So if they're really doing tafsir, you wouldn't be calling it ta'wil. But more importantly, what they're doing is they don't have evidence. They're just sort of changing it and saying we're doing ta'wil, doing tahrif. And this is important, and sometimes we have to be careful. We don't take people's claims. We look to see what they're actually doing. But now the Shaykh comes back and says, those are the people who went astray in this path. Whereas Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, who are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, he says, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they are the people affiliated and who have affiliation with this inscription. They are the people who are ascribed to the Sunnah because they stick to it. But those people who do not stick to the Sunnah regarding this position, they're the ones who do tahrif. So Shaykh gives us now a little bit about Ahl Sunnah. Why Ahl Sunnah called Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah? Sometimes you hear this, and sometimes you even think to yourself, why are we referred to as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah? Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen also explains elsewhere, and I'll mention that benefit, elsewhere in his explanation of Aqidatul Tahawiyah. He says they're called Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah because they ascribe to the Sunnah, they hold fast to it, and the Jama'ah because they are upon agreement. And this word comes to the word ijtima', or unity or community. So Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the Shaykh Muhammad also mentioned there in Wasatiyah, they are ascribed to the Sunnah, so that's people of Sunnah, wal Jama'ah because they're unified and what they believe and what they follow, and it comes to the word ijtima', unity or community. Sometimes you translate it Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah as the people of Sunnah and the community, or people of Sunnah and the unity, or who have unified on this issue. So just a side benefit in terms of Ahl Sunnah. If you hear it, now we understand. But the key element, we follow the Sunnah. As for others, they don't. So they don't have the right to ascribe themselves to that. And he mentions this in Sharh al-Wasatiyah, page 30. Now to finish now, the Shaykh is going to turn his attention to the people who went astray in Aqidah in general. And they are the people who says, are the people who fall into contradictions, falling into interpretations, and they are the people who are the people of philosophy, who are rhetoric. And he says that if you go back to the Sharh of Tahawiyah, Ibn Abi al-Izz al-Hanafi, he says that you find that people of knowledge, even amongst them, for example, he says you look at there, you find the statements of Al-Ghazali, who used to be from those people who are from people of philosophy and rhetoric, who reached the highest point of the apex in that field, even himself demonstrating how much error, inconsistency, and contradiction such people were in. Because it's those kind of people who have kalam who fall into all these things we're mentioning. They're the ones doing tahrif, ta'wil, takyif, ta'til, and saying this is the way of Islam. And then he says, Shaykh says, just to give you an indication of how misguided they were, you find them Ar-Razi, right? So one of the biggest amongst them. Look what he says. He says that the ultimate end of giving preference to the intellect is vanity. And the most of the efforts of the scholars of theological rhetoric is misguidance. He says here, نهاية الإقدام العقول عقال وأكثر السعي العالمين الضلال. He says that the ultimate end of giving preference to the intellect or over revelation is vanity. And most of the efforts of the scholars of theological rhetoric is misguidance. This is from amongst them, the people amongst them are saying this. This is the end result. Then it says, continuing, our souls are in desolation inside our bodies, while the ultimate goal of our lives is towards harmful and bad consequences. So you find that they didn't achieve anything. Through the philosophy and kalam, they didn't even themselves admitted the failure that they received. And Al-Ghazali, who himself retracted from much of this, he admits that they were people of confusion. There's one benefit you find in his biography that it's mentioned in the book Naqd al-Mantaq, right? The refutation or the criticism against logic. Al-Ghazali says himself, rahimahullah, أكثر الناس شكا, the most people, the people who have the most doubt, عند الموت, the time of death, are ashab al-kalam. People who have the most doubt during the time of death are the people of kalam. And he knows, he's from them, amongst the highest, and he finds the reality of them. So this idea of all these things mentioned, not the way of Ahl Sunnah. As Shaykh mentions to show that if we don't follow this way, the outcome of the people who did the opposite was failure. Whereas Ahl Sunnah, they are the people of success. People who died upon La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, Tawheed Rabbil Alameen. People who Allah is pleased with. People who took from the Quran and Sunnah and the way of the Salaf. They were guided. So Shaykh then says another quote of his, of Razi, mentioned that something that he says similar, where he says that has scrutinized the path of the free thinkers and the methodology of the philosophers, but have not seen it healing any sick, neither does it satiate the thirsty. However, I find the best way is to be that of the Quran. I read the following affirmation, Ar-Rahman al-Arsh istawa. And I found Allah's statement, إِلَيْهِ يَسْعَدُ الْكَلِمُ الطَّيِّبُ. And Allah's statement, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. And Allah's statement, وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِهِ عِلْمًا. But then, all of this, the recognition from them that the path of this way of philosophy and rhetoric is of nothing but failure. And Ibn Uthaymeen then finishes this introduction by mentioning that you will find them confused and inconsistent, not having any certainty about what you are upon. However, you will find the one Allah has guided to the straight path in tranquility, delighted, calm. He reads from the book of Allah and the sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He would affirm whatever Allah affirms from Himself of names and attributes, since no one knows Allah better than Allah, and no one is true in speech than Allah, no more explicit than Him in the mighty, the sublime. As Allah says, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ يُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ. Allah desires to make things clear to you. Allah says, يُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ أَن تَضِلُّوا. Allah clarifies things to you so that you don't go astray. Allah says, وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. And we sent down to thee a book to explain everything. And Allah says, وَمَنْ أَصْدَقُ مِنَ اللَّهِ قِيلًا. And who can be more truthful than Allah? وَمَنْ أَصْدَقُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حَدِيثًا. And who is more truthful than the word of Allah? To finish, Ibn Uthaymeen then finishes this introduction by mentioning that the people of such nature of doubt and rhetoric, they fall into confusion. They try to pose doubts to others. And some of these doubts are useless to begin with. And we have to remember that this path, Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we follow the Quran and Sunnah and the way of the Salaf. And we don't come with doubts that the people before us didn't come with. And nor did they raise in their mind. But this is important. Right? If anything was of importance, of knowledge and benefit, those before us would have achieved it before us. So he mentions that the example they may come with one, he says you find in our asr and hadir, in our present time, some may raise questions about Allah's descending. So when we affirm Allah's attributes, we affirm Allah descends every night and last day of the night. He says some of them may come and they may say, right, such things that regarding about this, right, to prove a question about how can Allah descend to earthly heaven in the third part of every night, which necessitates that He is in the earthly heaven throughout the nights, since the nights change from one place to another across the earth. So they bring this kind of confusion, this terrible question. How can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descend every third night when the night changes from place to place? What does this mean? So Shaykh said the first is, explain this, the companions never held such ideas in the first place. So this is already from a corrupted mind. Where did they come with this? And next he explains how we can understand this, how can we answer them. He says, however, to respond to the question, the hadith of Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam of Allah descending, as long as the third part of the night remains at a particular location, and the descent takes place there, while the descent will not occur in other places before the third part of the night or the midnight. There is none like unto Allah, the Almighty, the Sublime. The hadith also proves that the period of descent ends at the beginning of dawn. So there's no ishkal in the first place. So if it's 1/3 night for some, then Allah will descend. And others will descend. There's no confusion here. But you see how they try to already have these kind of resemblance and confusion they bring forth. And that's what the ulama, when they answer a similar question, they all answer the same way. For example, Uthaymeen likewise answers similarly in Majmu' al-Fatawa, volume 1, page 138, he answers the same way. Also, Hafid ibn Hajar al-Fath al-Bari, in volume 3, page 38. Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah also, Sharh Hadith al-Nuzul, he explains the same. He explains this whole hadith in page 112, he explains the same. And Shaykh Ibn Baz, all of them explain this way. And the first question is that the Sahaba never thought this way. So you see, when you don't follow the way of the companions and the way of the Sunnah, how you already oppose the question, which itself is like how Imam Malik, rahimahullah, when he was asked about the istawa, replied that istawa is ma'loom, and iman in it is wajib, wa su'al anhu bid'ah. Asking about its howness, its innovation, and it shows you again that when we're looking at these subjects, we follow the text and the way of the Salaf, and we follow the understanding that's related to us, then we won't have these doubts. So this is the introduction Shaykh rahimahullah does to the beginning of the book. Yes, he mentioned quite a bit about the different categories, so we have good understanding beforehand. Because Kitab At-Tawheed doesn't really get into so much the Rubi and Asma wa Sifat. He talks about a little bit. More of it is focused on the Uluhiyyah. So Shaykh did an introduction here to give us those background. So when we, inshallah, next we begin reading, we'll have the understanding. And bit by bit, inshallah, we'll benefit and increase our knowledge of Tawheed. Before we finish, we'll do a bit of questioning so that we may have some understanding that which we took. So I want to mention now, what is the definition of Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah? Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah? A servant to single out his actions to Allah. Right? So the Tawheed of Allah and the servant's actions which are different types. طيب. And we mentioned also al-ibadah. What are the essence of ibadah, or the elements you have to have in al-ibadah? Humiliation, love, and veneration. Good. And we also mentioned, when it comes to Tawheed al-Asma' wa Sifat, what does this mean? What's the definition of Tawheed of Allah's names and attributes? What does that mean? How can we define it? To single out Allah and that which He has of names and attributes. And they have two elements. What are those two elements you have to have? You have to include two things. Affirmation and negation of what? What do you negate? Likeness or comparable to Allah. Any comparable. Very good. Also we mentioned difference between a tamtheel and a takyif. We can summarize that. Good. Tamtheel is more specific than takyif. And what was the example al-Uthaymeen gave? So maybe in case that way it's easier for us to remember. Okay, so someone were to say Allah's hand is like the hand of the creation. Which one is this? Tamtheel. And what's takyif then? You just to imagine something in your mind without an example, without specific, this is takyif. Both are haram. And last benefit we mentioned at the end in regards to the issues of Tawheed. We want to compare one last bit between Tawheed al-Rububiyyah and Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. What's the difference between the two? Rububiyyah and Uluhiyyah.
Rububiyyah is singling out Allah and His actions.
Good. Rububiyyah, you single out Allah and His action. And Uluhiyyah, you single out, you give Allah His worship through singling out the action of the servant. So the action of the servant will come from Him. So that's Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. And we mentioned you can also call Tawheed al-Ibadah. So inshallah we'll end with that. If anyone has any questions, anything that they want to add or mind, inshallah they can do so. Good, exactly. The hadith in Bukhari, Muslim, Rasulullah made dua for Ibn Abbas and dua he said, وَعَلِّمْهُ تَأْوِيل. Allah teach him ta'weel, which means tafsir. ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ وَأَحْسَنَ تَأْوِيلًا. So ta'weel in that angle is good. But then you say ta'weel also in tafsir. So when these people say ahl ta'weel, really they're ahl tahrif. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned that the issue of ibadah is ism al-jami'. It's a comprehensive word. Ibadah, a comprehensive word. لِكُلِّ مَا يُحِبُّ اللَّهُ وَيَرْضَاهُ. For everything Allah loves and is pleased with. مِنَ الْأَقْوَالِ وَالْأَفْعَالِ, of actions and statements. ظَاهِرَةً وَبَاطِنَةً, apparent and hidden. So that's one of the two definitions of ibadah, and that's the most comprehensive definition. And he mentioned this originally in his Risala al-Ubudiyyah. Many ulama after him, all of them agreed to this being the best definition of ibadah that you can find. Any other questions or anything that someone wants to add? طيب, inshallah, next week we will continue. Right? Throughout the week, if you can review that which you have benefit, or you read, this will make it easier. But also, we can get the translation of the matan or the explanation. This will also aid in the study. And also something good to have at home as a reference in your library to read from and to study, to share with your family and friends. Wallahu a'lam. Subhanaka bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.